We're going. Now we're going. Getting ready to start a new year. Made another trip around the sun, so that's good, I reckon. Started in John here last time, and I'm really kind of shared with you my little epiphany last week on John, and I just this gospel to me is this book probably moves me more than about any other book in the Bible. Actually, I remember years ago, several years ago, when Leland Foster was here. If y'all remember him, he came. Old man sat here, and he lived, way out here. I mean, he lived so far out in the woods, you had to go towards town to hunt. It was bad. But I remember he would quote John to me. I went and seen him a few times, and he was living in an old travel trailer out there, and he would sit there and quote John to me, and tears would well up in his eyes, and I guess it really started meaning a lot to me, probably then, but as I have gone through it this time and been studying to do this class, the scope of it kind of overwhelms me, I think. I think it's just a powerful book, and the way he words it and the way he puts this together, I'm going to talk a little bit of that tonight, because I think we need to know that in order to really appreciate this book. It's easy to start to read something like John, or to read. A lot of people are like, I want to read the Bible through in a year, and that's a grand scheme if you want to do it. But it's one thing to read something, and it's another thing to really kind of understand the whole scope of what's going on, And I think that with John, I think you have to look at that. And we talked a little about that 7 days last time, but I wanted to talk about something else. There's 7 miracles in John. If you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you get all these miracles, right? All these parables, all this stuff. In John, you don't. John was what's the word I'm looking for? He was very meticulous in how he put it forward. There was a reason. And in John's gospel, it's not miracles, it's signs. John looked towards signs. It wasn't about the miracle, and there's a difference in that. There's a difference in terminology, difference in the language between a sign and a miracle. It's a different thing. It's a different idea. A sign, what does a sign do? What's a sign do? Yeah, it tells you where you're going, right? I mean, a sign does just that. A sign points you in the right direction, right? Isn't that what a sign does? A miracle is just an event. I mean, it's miraculous, and you go, oh boy, that's Christ. He did this big miracle. But more than that, you were looking for something that was pointing towards Jesus being the Messiah. And signs, and so in all these miracles that Jesus did and all these things he performed, John chooses these 7. And a couple of these you won't find anywhere else in the Bible, but in John's gospel. About 3 of these you won't find anywhere else but John's gospel. And some of them are big, I think. I think raising Lazarus, to me, that's a big one. I mean, that's like top of the list. That's like top 10, I think, don't you? I mean, that's big, right? Raising Lazarus from the dead. And you wonder, why is that not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? I mean, that's big. That's like astronomically big. But signs have to point us in the right direction, right? Signs have to point us towards something. Otherwise, we're going to wind up in the wrong place. It's like that old joke, where the guys come up and it says, the sign says the end is near, and then he goes a little further and they're driving a sign in the ground that says turn back now. And they go, oh, they're religious fanatics, and they drive off in the creek, and the one guy looks at the other one and says, maybe we should have said bridge out, because a sign has to tell you, a sign has to do the right thing, right? It has to communicate to you what you want to communicate. I always looked, and we talked about this last week. I know I'm kind of rambling, but we talked about this last week. Water into wine. To me, that, as much as Lazarus is like the epiphany of big miracles, right? I mean, it's like the top of the pile, right? I mean, I don't know if there's a bigger miracle than raising Lazarus. I just don't know there's a bigger miracle than that. I mean, let's face it, he was in the tomb 3 days, he stank, Nobody wanted, nobody thought Jesus could do it. I mean, that was huge. And John pivots off Lazarus because when you really start getting into John, you got to understand almost everything after 11, 13 especially on, is within the last few hours of Jesus' life. So John spends a tremendous amount of time right at the end of Jesus' life, like in the last few hours of Jesus' life. He spends a tremendous amount of time. But Lazarus is the pivot in John. You see, raising Lazarus is when he did that, that's when the Jews went back and said, oh, we need to kill this guy. That was the pivot point in John. Does anybody know what the pivot point is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? What Jesus did that was like the bad thing that everybody said, okay, now we got to get rid of him? Cleanse the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke cleanse the temples right at the end. Jesus cleanses the temple right at the end. In John's gospel, cleansing the temple is right at the start. So some people say, well, did Jesus cleanse the temple twice? Or is John just chronologically challenged, right? Is he just putting it at the first because he wants to make a statement at the first? Or are Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrong? Or why do we have this, why do we have the cleansing of the temple? Because John's gospel is where we get the 3.5-year ministry. It's where we get Passover, Passover. Remember? Because the miracle of Canaan, that's first Passover, right? Because he goes to Galilee, that's first Passover. So John's where we get the 3.5-year ministry. First Passover, second Passover, last Passover. That comes out of John's gospel. So John seems to be chronologically mixed in places, like, okay, did that happen here? Did that happen earlier? Why is John giving us this? But most scholars believe that Jesus probably cleansed the temple twice. Not just once, but 2 different occasions. Once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end of his ministry. So that's something to think about when we think about this miracle situation. We lost our deal, didn't we? She's getting it back. When we think about this miracle, no, she's not. I lost my wife. Where did she go? She's like a disappearing queen. So we got 7 miracles, right? And hold on a minute. I got to find Susie. Hey. Yep, computer quit. I know. Love you. Bye. Okay, technical support's on the way. Okay. And so we get these miracles, 7 distinct miracles. So as much as I think raising Lazarus is the pinnacle miracle in the Bible, the big one, does anybody think there's a bigger miracle than that in the Bible, you think? Or do we think we all agree that might be like the pinnacle miracle? And then, as much as I think that, in my mind, I always thought turning the water into wine was maybe the minimal miracle, Because when you think about turning water into wine, you're thinking, we didn't really save anybody's life here or cause anybody, we really didn't heal anybody, or, you know what I mean? We just made wine, which, I mean, that's a big thing, don't get me wrong, to turn water into wine, but it's not like it's a monumental event, And the way he did it, like, Mom comes to me, oh, Mom, I'm not ready, but, since it's you, I'll do it, That's always kind of how I looked at it. But then when I really got to studying it, and I shared that with you last week, it's like Jesus made that decision, and John included it. And so that's the first sign of John. And so I started to ask myself, I'm like, why was that important? Why did water into wine? Why would you even include that miracle if you're only going to do 7? You're only going to do 7. Out of all the things Jesus did, you're only going to do 7. Why would you do water into wine, right? I mean, why would you choose that one over all the other things Jesus did? Because, I mean, he raised other dead people, right? Made people see, made people hear, made people walk, threw out demons. Why that one? And then if you really start to look at what John's starting with here, this idea of who Jesus is, right? Jesus is nourishment. You see that? Yeah. Yeah, like he was like cared about his mother, and yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably true. I mean, his mother definitely had a part in it. That's why John put that in there. But, I really think that it goes back because so much of John's gospel is about this idea of Jesus' nourishment, Jesus feeding us, eat his blood, drink his, eat his body, drink his blood. This idea that Jesus is the Word and we feed on the Word, and this idea that Jesus is this nourishment. Woman at the well, if you drink this water, you'll never thirst again, right? This idea that Jesus is nourishing, Jesus is nourishment. And then we do the healing of the royal official son, and that's a miracle we're going to look at. And that's really a fascinating miracle. That's one of them miracles Jesus wasn't even there, right? I mean, he did that from a distance, and it was somebody that wasn't necessarily a Jew, which is interesting. The lame man feeding the 5,000, walking on the water, John 6. That's where we get that. We have that account in other Gospels, but Peter, all that comes out of John. Healing the man born blind. That miracle is there's 10 sermons in that miracle. I mean, the man born blind. That's the whole thing's amazing. The relationship the man had with his parents, the relationship he had with the temple officials, the relationship he had with Jesus. Have you ever thought in that miracle that, I was thinking the other day, and when Jesus healed that man, remember what he did? He put it on his eyes, and then he told him to what? He told him to go and wash off, right? And then when they went to question him, who is this Jesus? That man could literally say, I don't even know what he looks like. I've never saw him. I mean, he never saw him, did he? I mean, he never saw Jesus, never laid eyes on him. He didn't even know. He could honestly say, I don't even know. I don't know what he looks like. Isn't that an amazing miracle, that Jesus would do that? So we got 7 miracles. No parables in John. Isn't that interesting? Or not? We don't get them big parabolic discourses like we get in Matthew and Mark and Luke and these big stories, right? Don't get those in John. John doesn't do that. John doesn't talk about demon possession. John doesn't talk about really much anything about the Holy Spirit. John doesn't dwell on those topics. It's not something John's interested in. It's not what's motivating him. Not where he's trying to move us to with these signs. But this is big. 7 I am statements. Now, he says I am more than 7 times, so don't miss, and actually there's 9. I'll talk about this in a minute. But he says I am more than 7 times, but he only uses it for 7 references. Okay? Does that make any sense? In other words, in John 6:35, 41, 48, 51, he says Jesus is the bread of life. I am. I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. But it was 7 instances in John, and the I am is very significant because every time Jesus says I am, the Jews suck all the air out of the room, right? Because God said in Exodus 3, when Moses goes to the burning bush and he says, who do I say sent me? And he says the I am. God identified himself as the I am. If you look in Exodus, that's capitalized, I am. That's what God said. By this name they do not know me, right? I am. So every time that Jesus goes in there and uses that exact same words, the Jews suck all the air out of the room because when Jesus says that, he's saying, I'm God. You see? It's more than just saying, that's what that means to them. I'm God. And so in John, 7 different phrases that he says I am. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. John chapter 10, right? I am the good shepherd. Good shepherd passage of the Bible. John 10. I really hope as we go through this, I hope that you start to put this together. And what I mean by that is, I hope when you think about John, and I hope when you say, I hope that every chapter maybe we have something that you can stick in your mind and say, Nicodemus, right? John 3, woman at the well, John 4, good shepherd passage, John 14, high priestly prayer, John 17. I mean, I wish we could that's how I remember John, I guess, is because of these things. He says, I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life, John 11, right? I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14. I am the true vine, John 15. Now those are I am statements, almost noun I am statements. I am the bread of life. It's like a noun. I am, stating what I am. But two other times in the book of John, Jesus says I am. And I printed this. I didn't write this because I thought this was better than I could probably write it. So there are two more I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. These are not metaphors. Rather, they are declaration of God's name. These are the really big I ams in the book of John, these two. These are the big I ams, okay? It says, as applied to Jesus himself. The first instance comes, Jesus responds to a complaint by the Pharisees. I tell you the truth, Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am. John 8:58. That was a huge, that's just phenomenally huge. That speaks volumes. Before Abraham was, I am. Speaks about the divinity of Christ, speaks about the eternity of Christ, speaks about Christ being in creation, which John starts with in 1. It says, I am God. It's a huge statement in John 8. And the verbs, and these are verbs, this isn't a noun statement, right? Does that make any sense, what I'm saying? You know, a noun statement's like just a statement, like, you know, I am a chair, right? But these are verb statements. These are Jesus actually expressing his deity. And he says, the verb Jesus used are in stark contrast with each other. Abraham was, but I am. You see? Abraham was. Does that make any sense? You know? And then he says, there's no doubt the Jews understood Jesus' claim to be the eternal God incarnate because they took up stones to kill him in 59. If you read that passage in John 8, when Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am, they took up stones to kill him because it was blaspheme. He was claiming to be God. In their mind, he was claiming to be God. The second instance of Jesus applying himself, the name I am, comes in the Garden of Gethsemane when the mob came to arrest Jesus. I did not know this until yesterday. I did not know this until yesterday. I thought this was really interesting. It says the mob came to arrest, asked him who they sought, and they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus replied, I am he. The he is added. You know, my whole life when I read that, it's like, you know, I am he, you know, I am him. But that's added. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus says, I am. Jesus right there, he made that declaration, I'm God. I thought that was really fascinating. It said, then something strange happened. When Jesus says, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. I always wondered why they did that. Have you ever wondered that when you read that story? I mean, here's Jesus unarmed in the garden at night. Nobody there to defend him. Well, Peter, you know, strikes off Malchus's ear, but, you know, beyond that. And then Jesus, when Jesus says, I am, all these armed guards and these priests and all these high-powered people and all of them people fell to the ground. I mean, boy, wouldn't you like to have been there, right? Isn't that amazing? I always wondered why they did that. I never could figure that out. Why did they go back and fall to the ground? Because Jesus said, I'm God, you know? And Jesus said, they drew back and fell to the ground, verse 6. Perhaps explaining the mob's reaction is the fact that the word he has been provided by our English translators. Jesus simply said, I am. Applying God's covenant name to himself, Jesus demonstrated his power over his foes and showed that his surrender to them was entirely voluntary. I never knew that till the other night. But when I read that, not ever knowing that, because it always fascinated, I never could figure out why they all fell to the ground. I just never could. I thought, well, maybe a light from heaven shone on him or something, you know, maybe there's some miraculous something that goes on we don't know, you know. But why they fell to the ground was because Jesus says, I am. And to them, that was a declaration that he's God. And for just an instant, you know, they might have thought it was going to go bad for them for just an instant, I think. Anyway, I thought that was pretty fascinating. Any comments? Yeah. Well, I think if he would have done something, I think they wouldn't have. I mean, I think it was one of them shock and awe deals. It was one of those instantaneous, when Jesus said that, they just automatically like fell down, but then I think when nothing happened, then they said, oh, well, you're just a. Yeah. Yeah, I think the garden was a messy affair. We really glorify it with art and paintings and depictions, but I mean, it was nice and it was gnarly, I think, I really do. I think it was confusing. I think it was, Judas betrayed him with a kiss. I mean, it was dark, who is this guy, there's a lot in the garden. Like I said, I think I always get the picture in my granny's house. She used to have these felt paintings, you know what I mean? You remember them? Of course, my favorite one that she didn't have was the dogs playing poker, but she had the Lord's Supper one, That's what was down in the billiard room, My uncle's house downstairs was the dogs playing poker, but she had the Lord's Supper, and she had the one of Jesus, in the garden with the moonlight streaming through the trees, and Jesus, and and I think that's my picture of the garden, in my mind. That's my picture in the garden, but I'm sure it was chaotic and dark and scary to be in that garden, I would think. Anyway, that's for free. But anyhow, any comments? Kind of interesting, isn't it? How John is moving us to this place. There's also 7 witnesses in John. John the Baptist, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Scriptures, miracles, and John the Apostle. 7 witnesses, we'll see that in there. 7 days are periods. The last half of the gospel covers 7 significant days. That's what's amazing about this gospel, is that halfway through, John only spends half of this on the life of Jesus. Half of this gospel is the last 7 days of Jesus' life. I think that's one thing to me that I never realized early on in my life. I never realized how that was. And then, when you start to really look at it and you start to really study it and you start to get into this idea that John's given us this real intimate, intricate view of the last 7 days of Jesus' life. What he was saying to his apostles, all these things and when you really think about the agony that was going on within Christ in the last 7 days, he knew this was coming, right? I mean, we all agree with that. Jesus knew this was imminent. Jesus knew he was going to die. He knew this was coming. And when I get to the last half of John, in my mind, I always think, what would you do if you had 7 days? I always ask myself that question, What would you do if you knew you had 7 days? That's it. 7 days left on the earth. If you knew you had 7 days, what would you do? I always think about that when I think about Jesus. What did he do? Last 7 days of his life. He knew it was the end. He knew he was going to get crucified. He knew he was going to leave. What did he do? Last 7 days of his life, you know what he did? He strengthened the people he was leaving behind. That's what he did. 7 days, that's what he did. He spent all that time with them men, preparing them for him to be gone. And that's just, and isn't that what you would do? Isn't that what I would do? If I knew I had 7 days left, I would spend all 7 of those days preparing the people I love for me not to be here anymore. Right? And that's exactly what Jesus did. 7 disciples. Isn't that interesting? There's 12, right? 7 mentioned in John. Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, who's probably Bartholomew, Thomas, and Judas Iscariot mentioned twice. So there's 12 apostles, but we don't have an apostle list in John, right? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have apostle lists. These are the 12. John doesn't do that. John doesn't give us that apostle list like they do in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We don't get that in John's gospel. So John's not concerned about that. John's not concerned about us knowing that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are already written a long time before John. All that stuff's there. All that stuff already exists. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. He absolutely read them. I don't think there's any doubt. No doubt in my mind. I mean, John is so much later than the Gospels. We're talking, 30 years. So by the time John was written, those other Gospels were well circulated by the time John was ever written. So there's no doubt in my mind, he would have read that. Yeah. Well, almost all the New Testament as we knew it was written before John wrote anything. I mean, he was the last of the bunch. So yeah, there's there's a lot in there. And if we go, I want to break a little early so we can bag carrots. Clyde said that would be a miracle. But John doesn't spend, there's no genealogies here, right? No Christmas story, no birth, none of that stuff. John doesn't do any of that stuff. If you wanted to see the birth of Jesus, you need to go to what two Gospels have that? Does anybody know? Luke and Matthew, right? Matthew and Luke. That's the only place you're going to get the birth story of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. Mark doesn't do it. John doesn't do it. John doesn't spend any of that, any time there at all. He doesn't. He mentions John the Baptist almost in passing at the beginning of the gospel. He goes immediately from Jesus being the Word, Jesus being, Jesus creating, Jesus doing all these things, the world not knowing him, not receiving him, give the right to become children of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, and glory is the only begotten, and the grace of truth. And then he almost as an afterthought, almost as a footnote, he puts in a few verses here about John the Baptist. But this is where John starts. So John's leaving all that other stuff to everybody else. He's not going to give you genealogies. He's not going to give you birth stories. He's not going to give you Jesus on the temple at 12. He's not going to give you any of that stuff. You're not going to get that here. John moves immediately into the ministry of Christ. He doesn't waste any time getting there. He speaks about John. John testified. I do think that, he gives us a couple of things about John that are really, really fascinating. It's interesting how he jumps from 15. If you really look at this text, it says, Jesus testified about him and cried out, saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. And that's a John statement, That's what John, at the beginning of John, that's what he wants you to see more than any other thing, is that Jesus existed forever. Jesus was in the beginning with God. Jesus existed forever. John wants you to see that, and that's how come he says, John, this is the testimony. Remember I said there were 7 witnesses, right? 7 witnesses in John. This is the witness of John, okay? John says he existed before me. That's not all we're going to get out of John, right? It said, no one has seen God, the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father. He has explained him. This is a testimony of John. So this is John's witness, okay? This is the testimony of John when the Jews sent the priests, the Levites from Jerusalem. Who are you? And he said, I am not Jesus. And what are you? Are you Elijah? Which looks at Malachi. Are you Elijah? He said, I'm not. Are you a prophet? No. That kind of is contradicting in the New Testament a little bit. But they said to him, who are you, so we may give an answer to those who are sent? And he says, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as Isaiah the prophet said. And they asked him and said, why then are you baptizing if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet? And John answered, I baptize in water, for among you in water, but among you stands one whom you do not know. It is he who comes after me, the thong of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. These things took place in Bethany beyond the Jordan, where John was baptizing. So that's the beginning of John. John's beginning is the witness. John the Apostle's beginning of his gospel is a witness of John the Baptist, that Jesus Christ is the Christ. I'm not the Christ. John says, I am not the guy. This is the guy. You do not know him, but I'm not worthy. So that's the first witness of John is John the Baptist. So he's going to go from a witness to a sign, okay? But we're going to quit so we can bag carrots, because we got a lot of carrots. So if you're able and willing, if we'll go back here, you got some bags, right, Sherry? Sherry has bags. All we're doing is we're just filling gallon Ziploc bags with carrots. That's all we're doing. They're just carrots on a pallet. We just need to fill the Ziploc bags with carrots and zip them shut. We got like a pallet. However many will fit. However many will fit. Yep. So if you all got time for a few minutes, let's go bag some carrots.